The morning fog rolled off San Diego Bay like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of Naval Base Coronado as it came alive with the controlled chaos of another training day. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the distant rumble of jet engines and the sharp bark of drill instructors putting new recruits through their paces. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez stepped out of the unmarked sedan that had brought her from the airport, her civilian clothes deliberately unremarkable. Dark slacks, a simple white blouse, and a navy blazer that could have come from any department store. Her only luggage was a small duffel bag and a worn leather briefcase that had seen more airports than most people see in a lifetime. She was 42, though the years had been kind in some ways and brutal in others. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that was striking without being beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, intelligent brown eyes, and a mouth that smiled rarely but genuinely when it did. What people noticed first, if they bothered to look closely, was her posture. She carried herself with the unconscious precision of someone who had learned that good bearing could mean the difference between life and death. The driver, a young petty officer whose name tape read Hassan, pulled her bags from the trunk. "Ma'am, I can escort you to the administration building if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," Elena replied, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that could have been from anywhere in the Southwest. "I can find my way." Hassan hesitated. The woman didn't look like she belonged here. She was too old to be a new recruit, too casually dressed to be an officer, and too calm to be the wife or family member of someone in crisis. "Are you sure, ma'am? The base can be confusing if you haven't been here before." Elena shouldered her duffel with practiced ease. "I'll manage. Thank you." She walked toward the main gate, her stride neither hurried nor hesitant. The Marines at the checkpoint barely glanced at her as she approached, their attention focused on a convoy of vehicles entering the base. When she reached the security station, she handed over her identification without being asked. The guard, a corporal with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the desert sun, scanned the card and frowned slightly. "Consultant identification. What kind of consulting, ma'am?" "Operational efficiency," Elena said. It was true in a way. Just not the kind of efficiency that appeared on organizational charts or budget reports. The corporal handed back her ID and waved her through. "Have a good day, ma'am. Check in with Building 1482 for your temporary access badge." Elena nodded and continued through the gate, disappearing into the maze of concrete buildings and asphalt roads that made up the heart of the naval complex. Behind her, the corporal made a note in his log. 800, Civilian Consultant E. Martinez, cleared for base. Access. Purpose, Operational Efficiency Review. The name in his log wasn't Elena Vasquez. It wasn't even close, but that was intentional. Elena Vasquez was a cover identity, carefully constructed over the past 3 months, complete with employment history, credit records, and enough digital footprints to satisfy any background check that didn't dig too deep. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? As Elena walked deeper into the base, she allowed herself a moment of observation. Naval Base Coronado was massive, a sprawling complex that served as home to SEAL teams, aviation squadrons, and support personnel. It was also, according to her briefing materials, experiencing what the Navy euphemistically called leadership challenges in its junior officer ranks. 3 formal complaints in 6 months, 2 requests for transfer that had been denied, 1 attempted suicide that had been hushed up and attributed to personal issues. And running through all of it like a poison thread was the name of Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke, a fast-track officer whose father was a retired admiral and whose connections had kept him insulated from consequences that would have ended any other officer's career. Elena's job was to document the pattern, gather evidence, and provide the Navy with enough ammunition to finally remove Rourke without triggering a political firestorm. It was delicate work, the kind that required patience and invisibility, the kind of work she had been doing for longer than she cared to remember. She found Building 1482 without difficulty, a 3-story concrete structure that housed administrative offices and training coordination. The temporary access badge process was routine and mindless, handled by a bored yeoman who typed her information into a computer without looking up from his screen. "Duration of assignment?" he asked. 6 weeks, Elena replied. "Sponsor?" "Oh, Commander Patricia Wells, Naval Special Warfare Command." The yeoman printed her badge and slid it across the counter. "Ma'am, you'll need to wear this at all times while on base. Any questions?" "Where's the nearest mess hall?" He pointed toward a wall map. "Trident Dining Facility, about half a mile that way. Opens at 0600, closes at 2100. Elena clipped the badge to her blazer and picked up her bags. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass door. Elena Martinez, operational efficiency consultant, stared back at her. The woman in the reflection looked tired but competent, someone who might spend her days analyzing workflow charts and recommending software upgrades. She looked nothing like Rear Admiral Elena Vasquez, one of the youngest flag officers in naval history, holder of 2 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross, and the architect of 3 successful counterterrorism operations that would remain classified for the next 50 years. That woman was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed identity and practiced deception. She would stay buried until the mission required otherwise. And Elena hoped, with the kind of hope that had sustained her through 2 decades of impossible assignments, that this time she could complete her work without anyone discovering who she really was. The hope was familiar. It was also, she suspected, futile. The bachelor enlisted quarters, where Elena had been assigned temporary housing, was a sterile, functional building that smelled like industrial cleaner and fresh paint. Her room was on the 3rd floor, a small space with a narrow bed, a metal desk, and a window that overlooked the training fields, where young sailors were learning the difference between wanting to be warriors and actually becoming them. She unpacked methodically, placing her few belongings in the provided dresser and closet. To anyone who might search the room, she would appear to be exactly what her cover claimed, a middle-aged consultant with simple needs and modest habits. Her clothes were unremarkable, her toiletries standard drugstore brands, her reading material consisting of management theory books and technical manuals. Hidden in the lining of her briefcase, accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look, were items that told a different story. A satellite phone with encrypted capabilities, a hard drive containing classified personnel files, and a small notebook filled with the kind of operational details that could end careers or save lives depending on how they were used. Elena had learned long ago that successful deep cover work required thinking in layers. The surface layer, Elena Martinez, consultant, had to be perfect and boring. Beneath that was the operational layer, the real reason she was here, the mission parameters, the evidence she needed to gather. And beneath that, buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed, was the core layer. Admiral Elena Vasquez, the woman who had chosen this life and all its costs. She finished unpacking and checked her watch, 11:30 hours. Late enough in the morning to avoid the breakfast crowd, early enough to scout the terrain before the lunch rush. She locked her room and headed for the Trident Dining Facility. The walk took her through the heart of the base, past training buildings and administrative offices, past groups of sailors and Marines moving with the purposeful efficiency that characterized military life. Elena observed everything, cataloging faces and noting relationships, but she was careful not to appear too interested. Elena Martinez would be focused on her own concerns, not studying the social dynamics of every group she passed. The Trident Dining Facility was a large institutional building designed to feed hundreds of people efficiently rather than pleasantly. Elena entered through the main doors and joined the line of personnel, waiting to be served. She selected a simple meal, grilled chicken, rice, vegetables, and looked around for a place to sit. The dining hall was arranged in a predictable hierarchy. Senior officers clustered at tables near the windows, talking in low voices about matters that wouldn't appear in official reports. Mid-level personnel occupied the center section, their conversations ranging from work complaints to weekend plans. And at the back, near the kitchen doors, junior enlisted personnel ate quickly and quietly, mindful of their place in the food chain. Elena chose a table in the middle section, alone but not conspicuously so. She ate slowly, listening to the conversations around her while appearing to read a technical manual she'd brought as a prop. Within 20 minutes, she had identified 3 potential sources of information and overheard 2 complaints about training schedules that might prove relevant. She was finishing her meal when she heard the laughter. It started as a low chuckle from a table near the officer section, then grew louder as others joined in. Elena glanced up from her manual to see 4 men in lieutenant bars gathered around one who was obviously holding court. The speaker was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of classical good looks that suggested he'd never faced serious adversity in his life. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearing confident to the point of arrogance. Elena didn't need to check his name tape to know she was looking at Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke. So this girl, and I use the term loosely, shows up at the morning briefing looking like she slept in a storage locker, Rourke was saying, his voice pitched to Carrie without seeming to try. Hair all over the place, uniform that looked like she'd borrowed it from someone twice her size. And she has the balls to ask me if I thought the training schedule was sustainable. More laughter from his audience. Elena kept her expression neutral, but she noted the dynamics at play. Rourke was performing for his subordinates, establishing dominance through mockery. Classic behavior for someone who confused authority with leadership. "What did you tell her?" one of the lieutenants asked. Rourke's grin widened. "I told her that maybe if she spent less time questioning her superiors and more time learning how to present herself like a professional, she might actually have a chance of making it in the Navy." "Did she say anything back?" "She just stood there like a deer in headlights. Typical. They push these diversity hires through the system and then act surprised when they can't handle real feedback." Rourke took a sip of his coffee, savoring both the liquid and his audience's attention. "The whole program's gone soft. We're so worried about hurt feelings that we've forgotten what it means to maintain standards." Elena felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest. She had heard variations of this speech 100 times in a dozen different contexts. It was always the same. Men who had never been tested talking about standards they'd never had to meet, using the language of meritocracy to justify behavior that was simply cruel. She closed her manual and stood to bus her tray. As she passed Rourke's table, she caught a fragment of his next comment. "Needs to understand that this isn't a social club. We're preparing for war, and if she can't handle a little honest criticism..." Elena continued walking, her face showing nothing. But she was already composing her first report in her mind. Rourke's behavior was textbook hostile environment creation, using official feedback sessions to humiliate subordinates, wrapping personal attacks in the language of professional development, creating a climate where challenging his authority was tantamount to admitting weakness. It was exactly the kind of behavior that had driven 3 formal complaints, and who knew how many informal ones. The kind of behavior that made young officers question whether they belonged in the Navy, whether they were strong enough, whether they deserved to be here. Elena had seen it before. She had lived through it herself, years ago, when she was a young lieutenant learning that competence meant nothing if you couldn't navigate the unwritten rules of military culture. The difference was that she had been stubborn enough to survive it, determined enough to thrive despite it, and eventually powerful enough to change it. But not everyone was that stubborn. Not everyone had that determination. And some people broke under pressure that should never have been applied in the first place. As Elena left the dining facility, she made a mental note to identify the young officer Rourke had been mocking. The woman deserved to know that someone was watching, that her experiences were being documented, that the system, however slowly, however imperfectly, was capable of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a small comfort, but it was all Elena could offer for now. The rest would come later, when she had gathered enough evidence to ensure that Bradley Rourke's career ended with the disgrace it had always deserved. Elena spent the next 3 days establishing her routine and building her cover. She attended meetings with various department heads, reviewed training protocols, and asked the kinds of bland questions that operational efficiency consultants were expected to ask. She was professionally invisible, competent enough to justify her presence, boring enough to be forgotten the moment she left the room. But while Elena Martinez gathered her surface-level information about workflow optimization and resource allocation, Admiral Elena Vasquez was conducting a much deeper investigation. She had identified Lieutenant Sarah Chen as the young officer Rourke had mocked in the dining facility. Chen was 26, an Annapolis graduate with stellar academic credentials and 2 years of exemplary service. Her performance reviews were consistently excellent, but Elena could read between the lines of the official language. Phrases like "would benefit from increased confidence" and "shows potential for leadership growth" were bureaucratic code for an officer who was being systematically undermined by her superiors. Elena had also identified Rourke's inner circle, 3 lieutenants who seemed to orbit around him like planets around a toxic sun. They were younger men, eager for advancement and willing to echo their commander's attitudes in exchange for his favor. The dynamic was familiar and predictable. Ambitious subordinates enabling a narcissistic superior because they believed association with power would somehow transfer that power to them. On Thursday morning, Elena was reviewing maintenance logs in Building 1482 when she overheard a conversation that made her pen pause above the paperwork. Farr told her she needed to toughen up if she wanted to make it in a real deployment, someone was saying in the corridor outside the office she'd been assigned. I mean, she's probably never been anywhere more dangerous than a college campus. Elena recognized the voice as Lieutenant Marcus Webb, one of Rourke's loyal followers. She kept her head down and continued writing, but her attention was focused entirely on the conversation. What did she say? This voice was unfamiliar. Another junior officer, probably. Nothing. Just stood there and took it, which is probably for the best. Rourke doesn't like it when people talk back, especially her type. Her type, Webb laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Come on, man, you know what I mean. Diversity hire. Probably never had to work for anything in her life. These affirmative action cases always fold under pressure. Elena's pen snapped in half. She stared at the broken pieces of plastic and ink, her hand clenched around what remained of the barrel. For just a moment, the careful construction of Elena Martinez had cracked, revealing something underneath that was much harder and infinitely more dangerous. She took a slow breath and released the broken pen, watching the pieces fall to the desk. Then she stood and walked to the supply closet, where she found a replacement pen and returned to her paperwork as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Webb's casual racism, wrapped in the language of military standards, had triggered a reaction that Elena couldn't entirely suppress. She had heard that same language used against her when she was a young lieutenant, had watched it destroy the careers of officers who were twice as capable as the men using it against them. The difference was that Elena had survived long enough to gain the power to fight back. Sarah Chen might not be so fortunate. That afternoon, Elena arranged to observe a training exercise that Chen was helping to coordinate. She positioned herself in the observation area, clipboard in hand, looking every inch the detached consultant, evaluating operational efficiency. The exercise was a hostage rescue simulation designed to test communication protocols and decision-making under pressure. Elena watched Sarah Chen move through her responsibilities with quiet competence, coordinating radio communications, tracking team positions, adjusting the scenario parameters in real time to maintain appropriate challenge levels. The young officer was good at her job. More than good, she was exceptional. Her situational awareness was acute, her decision-making process was logical and rapid, and her communication style was clear and direct without being abrasive. Elena had seen senior officers with less natural command presence, but when Lieutenant Commander Rourke arrived to observe the final phase of the exercise, the entire dynamic shifted. Elena watched Rourke position himself directly behind Chen's station, close enough to see her screens, but also close enough to invade her personal space. He said nothing at first, just stood there, his presence a weight on her shoulders. Elena could see the young officer's posture change. Her movements became slightly less fluid. Her voice carried a trace of tension that hadn't been there before. "Communications are lagging," Rourke said suddenly, his voice pitched to be heard by everyone in the observation area. "How long since the last check-in from Team 2? Chen glanced at her display. 47 seconds, sir. Well within normal parameters for this phase of the exercise." "Normal for what baseline? Are you using peacetime standards or deployment standards?" It was a trap question, the kind designed to make the respondent look foolish, regardless of how they answered. Elena recognized it immediately, a technique favored by insecure leaders who needed to demonstrate their superiority by making subordinates appear incompetent. Chen's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Elena caught it. "I'm using the standards specified in the training manual for this exercise, sir." The training manual. Rourke's tone made it sound like a personal failing. "And do you think our enemies are going to limit themselves to training manual standards when they're shooting at you?" Before Chen could respond, one of the radio operators called out an update. "Team 2 reports successful breach, 3 tangos down, hostage secured." It should have ended the conversation. The exercise was proceeding exactly as designed, Chen's coordination was flawless, and the objective was being achieved ahead of schedule. But Rourke wasn't finished. "Lucky timing," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Let's see how you handle something that's not in the manual." He reached past Chen to key the communications panel. "All teams, this is Control. We have reports of secondary explosives in the target building. Modify your extraction route and advise." Elena felt her jaw tighten. Rourke had just unilaterally changed the exercise parameters without consulting Chen or following established protocols. It was a dangerous precedent, the kind of impulsive decision-making that got people killed in real operations. But Chen adapted smoothly. Within seconds, she had pulled up building schematics, identified alternative extraction routes, and was coordinating the teams through the modified scenario. Her performance under unexpected pressure was exactly what Elena would have expected from a top-tier officer. Rourke watched her work with obvious disappointment. He had been hoping to see her fail, to justify his preconceptions about her competence. Instead, he was witnessing exactly the kind of adaptability and leadership that the Navy claimed to value. "Adequate," he said when the exercise concluded successfully. It was damning with faint praise, the kind of evaluation that would look reasonable on paper, but would poison Chen's reputation through implication. Elena made notes on her clipboard, but they had nothing to do with operational efficiency. She was documenting a pattern of harassment disguised as leadership, creating a record that would be useful when the time came to present her findings. As the observation area emptied, Elena found herself walking behind Rourke and his followers. She wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but she wasn't trying not to listen either. "Think she'll last the full deployment?" Webb was asking. "Doubtful," Rourke replied. "First time someone starts shooting back, she'll fold. These academic types always do." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder, where shrapnel scars from Fallujah were hidden beneath her blazer. Academic types, she thought with dark amusement, if only he knew. But that was exactly the point. He didn't know, couldn't know, would never know unless she chose to tell him. And that ignorance was both his weakness and her advantage. She had learned over the years that people revealed their true nature when they thought no one was watching who mattered. Rourke was performing for his subordinates, displaying the casual cruelty that he believed made him appear strong and decisive. He had no idea that every word was being catalogued by someone with the power to end his career with a phone call. Someone who had faced enemy fire and made life-or-death decisions while he was still learning which fork to use at formal dinners. Someone who understood with absolute clarity the difference between genuine strength and the performance of strength. Elena continued making her notes as she walked back to her temporary quarters. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of gathering testimonies from Rourke's other victims. She would document the pattern of abuse, the systematic erosion of confidence and morale that he was inflicting on junior officers. And when she had enough evidence, when the case was airtight and undeniable, she would reveal exactly who Elena Martinez really was. But not yet. For now, she was content to remain invisible, to watch and wait and build her. Case one, small piece at a time. The hunt had begun. Elena had been on base for 12 days when the crisis that would change everything began with a routine equipment inspection that went catastrophically wrong. It was 06:30 hours on a Tuesday morning when the explosion rocked Building 1847, the primary communications hub for all naval operations on the West Coast. Elena felt the tremor through the concrete floor of her temporary office 3 buildings away. A deep, bone-rattling vibration that made her coffee cup dance across her desk. Within seconds, alarms were blaring across the base. The loudspeakers crackled to life with the measured voice of the base commander. "All personnel, this is not a drill. Report to emergency stations. Repeat, this is not a drill." Elena looked up from her morning reports, her mind instantly shifting from Elena Martinez, consultant, to Admiral Elena Vasquez, officer. She recognized the sound pattern, not incoming fire, not an attack, but an internal emergency. Equipment failure, possibly explosive in a critical facility. She stood and moved to her window, looking toward the communications building. Black smoke was pouring from the third floor, and she could see figures in emergency gear already responding. But something was wrong with the response pattern. Personnel were moving too slowly, with too much confusion. Someone wasn't coordinating properly. Elena grabbed her temporary access badge and headed for the door. She told herself she was just going to observe, to see if this crisis might provide intelligence about the base's operational readiness that would be useful for her real mission. But as she jogged toward the emergency scene, she felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders. She had responded to crises before, in the Persian Gulf, in the Horn of Africa, in places where hesitation measured in seconds could cost lives. Her body moved with automatic precision, her mind cataloging threats and resources and options with the kind of clarity that only came from years of experience making decisions under pressure. The communications building was surrounded by emergency vehicles, but Elena could see immediately that the response was poorly coordinated. Fire and rescue teams were setting up in each other's way. Medical personnel were staged too close to the building. Security forces were blocking access routes that other responders needed. And in the center of it all, Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke stood with a handheld radio, trying to coordinate operations for which he was neither trained nor temperamentally suited. "I need damage assessments from all floors," Rourke was saying into his radio, his voice carrying the edge of someone trying to project authority he didn't feel. "And get those medical teams back another 50 yards. "Sir," a chief petty officer approached him, "we're getting conflicting reports about electrical systems. Should we shut down power to the whole building?" Rourke hesitated. It was a critical decision. Cutting power might prevent additional fires, but it would also disable emergency lighting and ventilation systems that were keeping smoke from accumulating in the stairwells. People were still evacuating from the upper floors. Yes. No, wait. How many people are still inside?" The chief's expression showed what he thought of that response. "Unknown, sir. The floor wardens haven't reported in yet." Elena moved closer, positioning herself where she could observe the decision-making process. She could see the uncertainty in Rourke's face, the way he was looking around for someone else to take responsibility for choices that might have life-or-death consequences. This was what separated leaders from people who merely held leadership positions. When lives were on the line, when there was no time for committees or cover-your-ass protocols, some people rose to the challenge and others froze. Rourke was freezing. "Sir," another voice cut through the chaos. Lieutenant Sarah Chen appeared at Rourke's elbow, her uniform soot-stained, her face streaked with sweat. "I've just come from the building. The explosion was in the electrical switching room on the third floor. We have 18 people trapped in the stairwell between the third and fourth floors. Smoke is too thick for them to descend, and the fourth floor exit is blocked by debris." Rourke turned to face her, and Elena saw the flash of irritation cross his features. Even in a crisis, his first instinct was to resent being upstaged by a subordinate, especially this subordinate. "I'm coordinating the response here, Lieutenant," he said sharply. "You should be—" "Sir, with respect, we need to get power to the emergency ventilation system immediately, or those people are going to succumb to smoke inhalation within the next 10 minutes. It was the right assessment, delivered with exactly the kind of calm urgency that effective crisis management required. Elena felt a surge of professional approval. Chen was demonstrating the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught in classrooms, the ability to see clearly under pressure and focus on what mattered most. But Rourke wasn't hearing the content of her advice. He was hearing a challenge to his authority. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice rising, "I am the senior officer here, and I will decide—" He never finished the sentence. The second explosion was smaller but more focused, an electrical panel overloading somewhere in the building's basement level. The lights went out across half the base, and the emergency ventilation systems that had been keeping the trapped personnel alive simply stopped. In the sudden silence that followed the dying hum of machinery, everyone could hear what had been masked by the electrical noise, voices calling for help from inside the building, growing weaker and more desperate. Elena had heard enough. She stepped forward, her movement cutting through the cluster of personnel around Rourke like a knife. "Chief," she said to the petty officer who had been trying to get guidance, "how long to get a portable generator connected to the building's emergency systems?" The chief blinked, surprised to be addressed by someone he didn't recognize. But something in Elena's voice, the absolute authority, the complete lack of uncertainty, made him respond automatically. 5 minutes, ma'am, if we can access the external hookup panel." "Where's the panel?" "North side of the building, ground level." Elena turned to the fire chief, a grizzled man in his 50s who was watching the exchange with sharp interest. "Chief, do you have breathing apparatus available for a rescue team?" "Yes, ma'am. But the stairwells are compromised, and we don't know. The stairwells are compromised by smoke, not structural damage," Elena interrupted. "With proper breathing protection and emergency lighting, a small team can reach the trapped personnel and guide them to safety. How many sets of gear do you have ready?" The fire chief's eyes narrowed. He was trying to place this woman, who seemed to know exactly what questions to ask and exactly what orders to give. 6 sets, ready to go," Elena nodded crisply. "Get your people geared up. I need 2 teams, one to escort the trapped personnel down, one to clear the debris from the 4th floor exit." She turned back to the chief. "Get that generator connected, now." For a moment, everyone moved with sudden purpose. The chief barked orders to his team. The fire chief began organizing his rescue personnel. Even the medical teams started repositioning to better support the operation. Then, Lieutenant Commander Rourke's voice cut through the activity like a rusty blade. "Hold it right there. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." Everyone stopped. Elena turned to face Rourke, and for the first time since she'd arrived on base, she allowed him to see something of who she really was. Not Elena Martinez, consultant, someone else entirely. "I don't know who you think you are," Rourke continued, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, "but you don't have authority to give orders to my personnel." The silence that followed was absolute. Elena could feel the eyes of every person in the area, firefighters, medics, security personnel, sailors, all of them watching this confrontation, while 18 people trapped in a smoke-filled stairwell waited for someone to decide whether they lived or died. Elena looked at Rourke for a long moment, measuring him. She saw a man whose pride was more important to him than the lives under his command, a man who would rather maintain his illusion of control than accept help from someone he perceived as beneath him. She thought about her options. She could back down, return to her cover, identity, let Rourke continue his ineffective attempts at crisis management while people died. It would preserve her mission, maintain her invisibility, keep her investigation on track. Or she could do what every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do. Elena's hand moved to the neck of her blazer. With 2 quick motions, she unclipped the temporary visitor's badge that identified her as Elena Martinez, consultant, and let it fall to the asphalt. Then she reached into her inner pocket and withdrew a different badge, one that most of the personnel around her had never seen in person, one that carried more authority than Rourke had ever imagined possessing. She held it up where everyone could see it, the eagle and stars of a Rear Admiral, United States Navy. "Chief," she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of absolute command, "connect that generator. Fire Chief, get your rescue teams moving. Medical, prepare for 18 casualties with potential smoke inhalation." The response was immediate and electric. Every person within sight snapped into motion with the kind of precision that only came from receiving orders from someone whose authority was unquestionable. Elena turned back to Rourke, who stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and something approaching panic. "Lieutenant Commander," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone, "you will step aside and allow qualified personnel to handle this emergency. We will discuss your performance afterward." Rourke's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Elena didn't wait for a response. She turned her attention back to the crisis, coordinating the rescue operation with the kind of calm efficiency that had made her the youngest female flag officer in naval history. Within 8 minutes, the generator was connected and emergency systems were restored. Within 12 minutes, the first of the trapped personnel were being guided to safety by rescue teams with breathing apparatus. Within 20 minutes, all 18 were accounted for and receiving medical attention. 0 casualties, 0 fatalities. A textbook emergency response executed under impossible circumstances. And standing at the center of it all, no longer hiding behind a false identity, was Admiral Elena Vasquez, the woman that Bradley Rourke and his followers had dismissed as just another diversity hire, just another consultant who didn't belong. The woman whose quiet competence had just saved 18 lives while exposing the criminal inadequacy of the man who was supposed to be protecting them. As the immediate crisis wound down and the rescued personnel were transported to medical facilities, Elena found herself surrounded by a growing crowd of base personnel. Word was spreading with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. The quiet consultant who had been wandering around for 2 weeks asking boring questions about operational efficiency was actually a fucking admiral. And she had just made Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke look like the incompetent, arrogant fraud he had always been. The base communications center had been secured, the rescued personnel were receiving medical attention, and the immediate crisis was over. But Elena knew that the real crisis, the one that would define her mission and potentially end her career, was just beginning. She stood in the parking area outside the damaged building, still holding her admiral's badge, surrounded by the controlled chaos of post-emergency operations. Personnel moved around her with new purpose, their previous casual disregard replaced by the sharp attention that came from realizing they had been in the presence of serious authority without knowing it. Elena felt the familiar weight of command settling fully onto her shoulders. For 2 weeks, she had been Elena Martinez, invisible, forgettable, powerless. Now she was Admiral Elena Vasquez again, and with that identity came responsibilities that extended far beyond her original mission parameters. Chief Petty Officer Morrison approached her first. He was the man who had been trying unsuccessfully to get coherent orders from Rourke during the crisis. His weathered face showed the kind of professional respect that senior NCOs reserved for officers who had proven themselves under fire. "Ma'am," he said, coming to attention, "Chief Morrison, Base Operations. I want to thank you for taking charge back there. Those people would have died if you hadn't stepped in." Elena nodded acknowledgement. "Chief, I need a full damage assessment of the communications center, and I need to know how long before primary systems can be restored." "Yes, ma'am. Initial estimates show we're looking at 72 hours minimum for full restoration, but we can have emergency communications up within 6 hours." "Make it 4, and Chief?" Elena's voice dropped slightly. "I want a complete record of the emergency response timeline. Every decision, every delay, every communication, official documentation." Morrison's eyes showed understanding. He had been watching Rourke's fumbling attempts at crisis management, and he knew what Elena was really asking for. Evidence. "Understood, ma'am. I'll have that report within 2 hours." As Morrison moved away, Elena became aware that other personnel were approaching, not crowding her, but positioning themselves where they could observe, where they could be part of whatever was happening here. Word was spreading through the base with viral speed, and she could see the ripple effects already beginning. Lieutenant Sarah Chen emerged from the crowd, her soot-stained uniform testament to her role in the initial response. She approached Elena with visible uncertainty, clearly struggling to reconcile the quiet consultant she thought she knew with the flag officer who had just taken command of a crisis. "Ma'am," Chen said carefully, "I'm Lieutenant Chen. I was the duty officer in the communications center when the explosion occurred." Elena studied the young officer's face. Chen looked exhausted, stressed, but also alert and focused. Despite everything she had been through, the emergency, the near-death experience of her trapped colleagues, the shock of Elena's revelation, she was still thinking like an officer, still trying to fulfill her responsibilities. "Your assessment of the situation was correct, Lieutenant," Elena said. Your recommendation to restore emergency ventilation immediately was the right call. How many of your people were among those trapped? 3, ma'am, all accounted for, all stable. And your current assessment of our communication capabilities? Chen straightened slightly, recognizing that she was being asked for a professional report by someone whose opinion would matter to her career. Primary satellite links are down, but we have backup systems operational. Internal base communications are functioning at about 60% capacity. We can maintain essential operations, but we're vulnerable. It was a clear, concise assessment delivered without hedging or excuse-making. Elena felt another surge of approval for this young officer who had been systematically undermined by Rourke's toxic leadership. Excellent. I want you to coordinate with Chief Morrison on the restoration timeline. And Lieutenant? Elena lowered her voice slightly. I want to speak with you privately once we've stabilized the immediate situation. Chen's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. Yes, ma'am. As Chen moved away, Elena became aware of a new presence at the edge of the crowd. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke stood about 20 yards away, his face pale, his uniform disheveled. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. Elena had seen that look before, on the faces of officers who had been caught in corruption, incompetence, or cowardice. It was the look of someone who knew their career was over, but hadn't yet accepted the reality of it. She wasn't ready to deal with Rourke yet. That confrontation would come, but first she needed to understand the full scope of what she had revealed by breaking her cover. Her original mission, documenting Rourke's pattern of harassment and building a case for his removal, had just become infinitely more complicated. Captain Patricia Wells, Elena's official sponsor for this assignment, appeared at her elbow. Wells was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran Naval Special Warfare Command with the kind of quiet competence that Elena had always admired. Admiral, Wells said quietly, we need to talk. Elena nodded. Captain, can you give me 30 minutes to ensure the immediate situation is stabilized? Of course, ma'am. But Elena... Wells's use of her first name indicated they were speaking privately, outside the chain of command. This is going to complicate things significantly. I know. Elena looked around at the crowd of personnel, all of them now aware that they had been working alongside a flag officer for 2 weeks without knowing it. But 18 people are alive who wouldn't have been if I'd maintained my cover. Wells followed her gaze. No argument there. But we're going to have to explain why a rear admiral was working undercover as an operational efficiency consultant. That's going to raise questions we might not want to answer. Elena understood the implications. Her investigation of Rourke was now public knowledge, which meant that every decision he had made over the past 6 months would be scrutinized. Every officer he had harassed, every report he had filed, every recommendation he had made would be viewed through the lens of potential bias and abuse of authority. It would be politically messy, potentially career-ending for several people, and exactly the kind of high-profile controversy that the Navy preferred to handle quietly. But Elena had learned long ago that some things were more important than political convenience. Captain, she said, I'll deal with the fallout. Right now, I need to make sure this base can continue to function. Wells nodded. Understood, ma'am. I'll start working on damage control from my end. As Wells moved away, Elena found herself momentarily alone in the center of the controlled chaos. She looked around at the base personnel, sailors, Marines, civilians, all of them going about their duties with the kind of enhanced focus that followed a crisis. Many of them were stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the unassuming consultant they had ignored with the flag officer who had just saved 18 lives. She could see the questions in their faces, the speculation, the slowly dawning realization that they had been part of something larger than they had understood. Elena's satellite phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a number she recognized immediately. Vice Admiral Marcus Thompson, her direct superior, and one of only 3 people who had known about her undercover assignment. She answered on the second ring. Admiral Vasquez. Elena, what the hell happened out there? Thompson's voice was tight with controlled frustration. I'm getting reports that you just blew your cover in front of half the base. Sir, there was an emergency situation that required immediate command intervention. Lieutenant Commander Rourke was unable to coordinate an effective response, and personnel were in immediate danger. A pause. Casualties? Zero, sir. 18 personnel were trapped by smoke and debris, all successfully evacuated. Another pause, longer this time. Elena could almost hear Thompson weighing the political implications against the operational success. Admiral, I need you to understand that this complicates your investigation significantly. Rourke's defense attorney is going to claim that your entire assignment was compromised from the beginning, that any evidence you gathered was tainted by personal bias. Elena felt a cold smile touch her lips. Sir, with respect, I think Lieutenant Commander Rourke is going to have bigger problems than my investigation. His response to this crisis was so inadequate that 18 people nearly died while he stood around worrying about his authority being questioned. You have documentation of that? I will, sir. Multiple witnesses, official timeline, recorded communications. His incompetence is going to be a matter of public record. Thompson sighed. All right, Admiral. Complete your assessment and return to Washington. We'll figure out how to handle this from here. Sir, respectfully, I think I should remain on base until the situation is fully stabilized. Elena, Thompson's voice carried a warning. Don't let this become personal. Elena looked across the parking area to where Rourke still stood, watching her with that expression of dawning horror. She thought about Sarah Chen's quiet competence, about the 18 people who had nearly died because of one man's incompetence, about the dozens of young officers whose careers had been damaged by systematic harassment disguised as leadership. Too late for that, sir, she said quietly. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Around her, the base continued its post-crisis operations with renewed efficiency. Personnel moved with purpose, communications flowed smoothly, and the kind of petty territorial disputes that had characterized Rourke's leadership style seemed to have evaporated in the face of genuine authority. Elena realized that she had just witnessed something that would have been impossible to achieve through any amount of paperwork or official investigations. She had seen the base personnel respond to real leadership, had watched them step up when someone they trusted was giving the orders. The contrast with Rourke's ineffective posturing was so stark that no amount of political maneuvering would be able to obscure it. Elena established a temporary command post in the base conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested serious business. Within an hour, she had transformed it into an efficient information hub, coordinating the ongoing emergency response while simultaneously gathering evidence of everything that had transpired. Chief Morrison had delivered his incident report with military precision, a minute-by-minute timeline that documented every order Rourke had given, every delay, every moment of hesitation that had nearly cost lives. Elena reviewed the document with growing professional disgust. It was worse than she had thought. The man had frozen when faced with actual responsibility. Literally frozen. For nearly 4 minutes during the critical initial phase, he had stood in place while personnel waited for orders that would never come. If not for Lieutenant Chen's unauthorized initiative in entering the building to assess the situation, they would never have known about the trapped personnel until it was too late. Elena's secure phone rang. This time the caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months. Admiral James Harrison, Chief of Naval Operations. When the CNO called personally, it meant that whatever situation you were involved in had just become a matter of national importance. Admiral Vasquez, she answered. Elena, I'm calling from a secure line. I need to understand exactly what happened at Coronado today. Harrison's voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority. I'm getting reports that one of my flag officers was working undercover at a training facility and just revealed her identity during an emergency response. Elena had known this call would come. She had also known that her explanation would determine not just the fate of her investigation, but possibly her entire career. Sir, I was conducting an authorized investigation into leadership failures in the junior officer ranks. During a communications facility emergency, the on-scene commander demonstrated such complete incompetence that personnel lives were in immediate danger. I made the tactical decision to assume command. 18 people trapped in a burning building, Harrison said. It wasn't a question. He had clearly been briefed on the basic facts. 0 casualties under your command, and the on-scene commander was Lieutenant Commander Rourke, the subject of your investigation. Yes, sir. Admiral, I need you to understand something. The moment you revealed your identity, your investigation became public knowledge. Every decision Rourke has made, every officer he's supervised, every report he's filed is now going to be scrutinized by Congress, by the media, by every advocacy group that thinks the Navy doesn't take harassment seriously enough. Elena felt the weight of that reality settling on her shoulders. She had known it intellectually, but hearing it articulated by the CNO made it concrete and immediate. Sir, I'm prepared to stand by my decision. The alternative was to let people die to protect an investigation. And that's exactly why I'm not relieving you of command. Harrison's response surprised her. She had been prepared for censure, possibly career termination. Elena, what you did today, taking command of a crisis situation and saving lives, that's exactly what we train flag officers to do. The political complications are secondary to operational success. Elena felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by professional gratitude. Harrison was backing her decision, which meant she would have the support needed to complete her mission properly. Sir, what are my orders? Complete your investigation, but Elena, you're going to do it as Admiral Vasquez, not as some undercover consultant. I want every aspect of Rourke's leadership documented officially. I want testimony from every officer under his command, and I want recommendations for systemic changes that will prevent this kind of toxic leadership from taking root again. Yes, sir. And Lieutenant Commander Rourke? Will be relieved of command pending the results of your investigation. Captain Wells will assume temporary command of his department. Elena nodded, then realized Harrison couldn't see her. Understood, sir. One more thing, Admiral. The media is going to get hold of this story within hours. I want you prepared to explain why we had a flag officer working undercover and why that was necessary to address leadership problems that our normal oversight mechanisms should have caught. That was the real challenge, Elena realized. The Navy would have to admit that its standard procedures for identifying and addressing toxic leadership had failed so completely that extraordinary measures had been required. It was an institutional admission of failure that would have consequences far beyond Bradley Rourke's career. Sir, I'll prepare a full briefing on systemic issues identified during my investigation. Good. Elena, for what it's worth, I think you made the right call. Saving 18 lives trumps bureaucratic convenience every time. The call ended, leaving Elena alone in the conference room with the weight of her expanded mission. She was no longer a covert investigator gathering evidence quietly. She was now the public face of the Navy's effort to address toxic leadership with all the political and professional risks that entailed. A knock on the conference room door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Lieutenant Sarah Chen entered, her uniform now clean and pressed, her bearing professional, despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. Ma'am, you asked to speak with me privately. Elena gestured to a chair. Please, sit down, Lieutenant. I want to hear about your experiences under Lieutenant Commander Rourke's leadership. Chen hesitated for just a moment, the natural reluctance of any junior officer to criticize a superior, even when that superior had just been revealed as incompetent. Elena recognized the reluctance and addressed it directly. Lieutenant, you need to understand that my investigation is now a matter of official record. Your testimony will be part of a formal inquiry that will determine Lieutenant Commander Rourke's future in the Navy. I need you to tell me the truth, not what you think I want to hear. Chen straightened in her chair. Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Rourke has created a hostile work environment for female officers and anyone he perceives as not meeting his personal standards of military bearing. Can you be specific? For the next 45 minutes, Chen detailed a pattern of systematic harassment that was even worse than Elena had suspected. Rourke hadn't just been undermining individual officers. He had been actively working to force out anyone who didn't fit his narrow conception of naval leadership. Female officers were subjected to constant questioning of their competence. Minority officers were given disproportionately difficult assignments and then criticized when they struggled. Officers from non-traditional backgrounds, prior enlisted, ROTC graduates, anyone who hadn't attended the Naval Academy, were treated as second-class citizens whose opinions carried no weight. "Ma'am," Chen concluded, "in my opinion, Lieutenant Commander Rourke represents everything wrong with naval leadership culture. He confuses dominance with authority, mistakes cruelty for toughness, and has no concept of leading by example." Elena made notes throughout Chen's testimony, but her primary focus was on the young officer's demeanor. Despite everything she had endured, Chen remained professional, articulate, and committed to the Navy. She hadn't been broken by Rourke's treatment. She had been strengthened by it, had learned to recognize the difference between authentic leadership and the performance of authority. "Lieutenant, one final question. If you could change one thing about the leadership culture in the Navy, what would it be?" Chen considered the question carefully. "Ma'am, I would make it clear that protecting your people is more important than protecting your reputation. Too many senior officers are more concerned with avoiding criticism than with ensuring their subordinates can succeed." It was a profound observation, delivered with the kind of clarity that comes from experiencing both good and bad leadership. Elena realized that Chen represented exactly the kind of officer the Navy needed to develop, someone who had seen the worst of military culture and still chose to serve, still believed that the institution could be better than its failures. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Your testimony will be part of the official record, and I want you to know that your courage in speaking honestly will help prevent other officers from experiencing what you've endured." Chen stood and came to attention. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." "Granted. What you did today, taking command when lives were at stake, that's what real leadership looks like. Thank you for showing us the standard we should aspire to." Elena felt something unexpected tighten in her chest. She had spent so many years working in the shadows, making decisions that would never be publicly acknowledged, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be recognized for simply doing the right thing. "Dismissed, Lieutenant. And Chen?" Elena's voice softened slightly. "You're going to be an outstanding naval officer. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As Chen left, Elena turned back to her growing stack of documentation. She had testimony from one of Rourke's primary victims, an official timeline of his crisis management failure, and support from the highest levels of naval command. But she also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She would have to face Bradley Rourke directly, would have to confront the man whose career she was about to destroy with the evidence of his own incompetence and cruelty. It was a conversation she was looking forward to. Elena had been Admiral Elena Vasquez again for exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes when the moment she had been dreading finally arrived. She was reviewing incident reports in the base conference room when her aide, a sharp-eyed petty officer named Rodriguez, who had been hastily assigned to assist her, knocked and entered. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Rourke is requesting permission to speak with you privately." Elena looked up from her paperwork. Through the conference room's glass wall, she could see Rourke standing in the corridor, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the chaos of the day, his posture rigid with the kind of military bearing that suggested either great discipline or barely controlled panic. She had known this confrontation would come, had been preparing for it since the moment she revealed her true identity. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were different things entirely. For the past 4 hours, she had been operating as Admiral Vasquez, issuing orders, coordinating responses, managing the complex aftermath of the communications emergency. It had felt natural, familiar, like putting on a uniform that fit perfectly after wearing clothes that were too small. But facing Rourke would require her to bridge two identities, the Admiral who had the authority to end his career, and Elena Martinez, the woman he had dismissed and ignored for 2 weeks. "Send him in, Rodriguez." Elena stood as Rourke entered, not out of courtesy, but because she wanted the psychological advantage of height and position. She remained behind the conference table, using the furniture as a barrier between them. Rourke came to attention with mechanical precision, his salute sharp and regulation perfect. But Elena could see the tremor in his hands, the tight line of his jaw, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet hers directly. "Admiral," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "Lieutenant Commander Bradley Rourke requesting permission to speak freely." "Permission granted, But first, Lieutenant Commander, I have some questions for you. Elena walked around the table, closing the distance between them deliberately. She wanted him to feel the weight of her presence, wanted him to understand that the power dynamic between them had shifted permanently and irrevocably. For the past 14 days, you have been working in proximity to someone you believed was Elena Martinez, an operational efficiency consultant. During that time, did you have any direct interactions with this individual? It was a formal question, the kind that would appear in official transcripts and legal proceedings. Elena was building a record, creating documentation that would support whatever disciplinary actions followed. Rourke's face had gone pale. Yes, ma'am, I observed her during routine base operations. Observed? Interesting word choice. Elena stepped closer, near enough that she could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Did you form any professional opinions about this consultant's qualifications or competence? The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If Rourke admitted to dismissing Elena Martinez as unqualified, he would be admitting to poor judgment in evaluating personnel. If he claimed he had recognized her competence, he would be contradicted by the testimony of his own subordinates who had witnessed his dismissive comments. Ma'am, I may have made some informal observations. Such as? Rourke's mouth opened and closed silently. Elena could see him calculating, trying to find words that would minimize his exposure while maintaining some shred of dignity. It was pathetic to watch, a man who had built his identity around projecting strength and authority, reduced to nervous stammering by the consequences of his own behavior. Lieutenant Commander, Elena said quietly, let me refresh your memory. On Thursday, in the Trident dining facility, you told a table of your subordinate officers that Elena Martinez was probably a diversity hire who wouldn't last in a real deployment. You questioned whether she had ever been anywhere more dangerous than a college campus. Rourke's face went from pale to gray. Ma'am, you stated that the Navy had gone soft, that we were so worried about hurt feelings, that we had forgotten how to maintain standards. Elena's voice remained calm, professional, but there was steel underneath. You suggested that she was dead weight, who would get real operators killed. Each word landed like a physical blow. Elena could see Rourke shrinking, his military bearing crumbling under the weight of his own words being repeated back to him by someone whose authority he couldn't question, whose competence he could never challenge. Ma'am, if I made inappropriate comments, If? Elena's voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. Lieutenant Commander, are you suggesting that multiple witnesses were mistaken about what they heard you say? No, ma'am, I may have spoken inappropriately. Elena walked to her briefcase and withdrew a folder, placing it on the conference table where Rourke could see it. The tab was labeled with his name, and the thickness of the contents suggested months of accumulated documentation. This folder contains testimony from 17 officers and enlisted personnel who have served under your command over the past 18 months. Would you like to know what they have to say about your leadership style? Rourke said nothing. He stood at rigid attention, staring at a point somewhere over Elena's shoulder, his jaw clenched so tightly that she could see the muscles standing out in his neck. Elena opened the folder and began reading selected excerpts, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. Lieutenant Commander Rourke made it clear that female officers would be held to different standards and that failure to meet those standards would result in negative fitness reports. He frequently questioned the competence of minority officers, suggesting that their presence in leadership positions was the result of political correctness rather than merit. During training exercises, he would deliberately create situations designed to embarrass officers he viewed as weak, often in front of their subordinates. Elena closed the folder and looked directly at Rourke. 17 separate testimonies, Lieutenant Commander, all describing a pattern of behavior that constitutes harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside the conference room windows, base personnel continued their duties, but inside this sterile space, 2 decades of military hierarchy and protocol hung in the balance. Ma'am, Rourke said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to maintain standards. I was trying to ensure that only qualified personnel. You were trying to maintain control, Elena interrupted. You confused dominance with leadership, mistook cruelty for toughness, and created a toxic environment that drove out some of the Navy's most promising young officers. She walked back around the table, positioning herself where she could see his face clearly. What she saw there was not defiance or anger, but something that looked like the slow crumbling of a carefully constructed self-image. But the most damning evidence against you isn't the testimony of your subordinates, Lieutenant Commander. It's your performance during today's emergency. Elena pulled out another document, Chief Morrison's incident timeline, with its minute-by-minute documentation of Rourke's paralysis during the crisis. At 0637 hours, you were notified of an explosion in the communications building. At 0639, you arrived on scene and assumed command of the emergency response. For the next 6 minutes and 43 seconds, 18 personnel were trapped in a smoke-filled stairwell while you stood in the parking lot worrying about your authority. She read from the timeline with clinical precision. 0645 hours. Elsie Rourke questions whether to cut power to building. No decision made. 0646 hours. Elsie Rourke asks for damage assessments but provides no guidance on priorities. E647 hours. Lieutenant Chen provides critical intelligence on trapped personnel. Elsie Rourke dismisses her recommendations. Elena set the timeline aside. Lieutenant Commander, during the most critical emergency this base has faced in 5 years, you were so concerned with protecting your ego that you nearly let 18 people die rather than accept advice from a subordinate you had deemed unworthy of respect. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Elena could see that Rourke understood the full implications, not just the end of his career, but the knowledge that his incompetence had nearly resulted in multiple, preventable deaths. "Ma'am," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I was trying to coordinate multiple agencies, trying to ensure proper—" "You were frozen," Elena said flatly. "You had no idea what to do, no plan for emergency response, no understanding of crisis management principles. You were a lieutenant commander with 15 years of service who fell apart the moment he faced real responsibility." Elena walked to the conference room door and opened it. Outside, she could see base personnel moving through the corridor. Sailors, Marines, officers, enlisted personnel, all of them going about their duties with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterized military life at its best. "Do you know what the difference is between a leader and someone who simply holds rank, Lieutenant Commander?" Rourke didn't answer. A leader understands that authority exists to serve a purpose larger than themselves. A leader knows that their primary responsibility is to their people, not their ego. A leader earns respect through competence and character, not through intimidation and fear. Elena turned back to face him. "You are not a leader, Lieutenant Commander. You never were. You are someone who confused rank with authority, who mistook fear for respect, who believed that tearing others down would somehow build you up." The words were delivered without anger, without personal animosity, but with the kind of finality that comes from professional judgment rendered after careful consideration. Elena was not attacking Rourke personally. She was stating an assessment based on documented evidence and observed behavior. "Ma'am," Rourke said quietly, "what happens now?" Elena walked back to her briefcase and withdrew an official document. She placed it on the table in front of him. "You are hereby relieved of all command responsibilities, effective immediately. You will report to Captain Wells for administrative reassignment pending the completion of a formal investigation into your conduct. Your security clearances are suspended and you are restricted to base until further notice." Rourke stared at the document without touching it. Elena could see him processing the reality of what was happening. The end of his career, the destruction of his reputation, the collapse of everything he had believed about himself. "Lieutenant Commander," Elena said, her voice softening slightly, "you had the privilege of leading some of the finest young officers in the Navy. You had the opportunity to shape careers, to develop the next generation of naval leadership, to be part of something larger and more important than yourself." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "Instead, you chose to use your authority to diminish others, to create fear where there should have been trust, to tear down where you should have built up. That choice has consequences. This is one of them." Rourke stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the relief document as if it were written in a language he didn't understand. When he finally looked up, Elena saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not anger or defiance, but a kind of hollow recognition. "Admiral," he said slowly, "may I ask you something?" Elena nodded. "How long have you been watching me? How long have you been building this case?" It was not the question Elena had expected. She had anticipated denials, excuses, perhaps even accusations that her investigation was biased or unfair. Instead, Rourke seemed to be grappling with the scope of his own failure. 14 days on base, Elena replied, but the investigation began 3 months ago, when the third formal complaint was filed against you. 3 months. Rourke repeated the words as if testing their weight. And in all that time, did I do anything right? Anything that suggested I might be capable of real leadership? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not defensiveness. Elena found herself in the unexpected position of seeing Rourke not as an antagonist to be defeated, but as a failed officer trying to understand where he had gone wrong. She considered her answer carefully. "You have technical competence, Lieutenant Commander. Your knowledge of naval systems and procedures is excellent. Your administrative work is thorough and accurate. If you had been content to be a staff officer, to focus on process and analysis rather than personnel management, you might have had a successful career." "But I wanted to command," Rourke said quietly. "I wanted to be the kind of officer my father was." Elena felt a flicker of understanding. "Your father was Admiral Robert Rourke, retired." "Yes, ma'am. He commanded carrier battle groups, led combat operations in 3 different theaters. He was everything I thought a naval officer should be." Elena had known Admiral Robert Rourke by reputation, a hard-driving officer from an earlier era when the Navy's culture was less evolved on issues of diversity and inclusion. A competent leader in many ways, but also a product of his time, with attitudes that would be considered problematic by today's standards. "Lieutenant Commander," Elena said carefully, "did your father teach you that leadership meant dominating your subordinates?" Rourke's face crumpled slightly. "He taught me that the Navy was no place for weakness, that officers who couldn't handle pressure would get people killed. He said that being liked was less important than being respected, and that respect came from strength." Elena nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand the psychological framework that had shaped Rourke's approach to leadership. He hadn't been deliberately malicious. He had been following a model of command that he believed was both effective and honorable. The tragedy was that the model was fundamentally flawed, based on outdated assumptions about human motivation and military effectiveness. "Your father was wrong," Elena said simply. The words hit Rourke like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked less like a disgraced officer than like a confused son trying to reconcile competing truths. "Ma'am, he served with distinction for 30 years. He was decorated for valor, promoted ahead of his peers, respected by—" "He was a product of his era," Elena interrupted, "and his era produced a lot of competent officers who believed that fear was an acceptable substitute for leadership. Some of them were effective despite their methods, not because of them." Elena walked to the window, looking out at the base where hundreds of young sailors and officers were learning what it meant to serve in the modern Navy. "Lieutenant Commander, the military has learned things about leadership that your father's generation didn't understand. We know that people perform better when they trust their leaders than when they fear them. We know that diversity makes organizations stronger, not weaker. We know that the mission is always served better by building people up than by tearing them down." She turned back to face Rourke. "Your father's approach to leadership might have worked in a different time, under different circumstances. But the world has changed, and the Navy has changed with it. The kind of leadership you learned from him is not just ineffective in today's military. It's counterproductive." Rourke was silent for a long moment, processing this fundamental challenge to everything he had believed about command authority. "So what I thought was strength," he said finally, "was actually weakness." "What you thought was strength was actually fear," Elena corrected. "Fear that your subordinates wouldn't respect you unless you dominated them. Fear that showing any vulnerability would undermine your authority. Fear that treating people with basic human decency would somehow compromise military effectiveness. Elena sat down across from him, abandoning the formal posture of superior to subordinate in favor of something more like a counseling session. "Bradley," she said, using his first name deliberately, "do you want to know what real strength looks like in military leadership?" He nodded mutely. Real strength is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, walking into a smoke-filled building to gather intelligence that would save lives, then having the courage to challenge a superior officer when she knew he was making the wrong decision. Elena leaned forward slightly. Real strength is Chief Morrison, who kept trying to get coherent orders from you even when it was obvious you were overwhelmed, because he put the mission above his personal comfort. Real strength is the 18 people who were trapped in that stairwell, who stayed calm and followed orders even when they couldn't see a way out because they trusted that their leaders would find a way to save them. Elena's voice grew quieter, more intense. Real strength is accepting that you don't have all the answers, that your subordinates might, know things you don't, that admitting mistakes is better than compounding them with pride. Rourke's face had gone through a series of transformations during this conversation, from defensive anger to hollow recognition, to something that looked like genuine understanding. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I destroyed my career because I was afraid of appearing weak." "You destroyed your career because you chose ego over effectiveness," Elena replied. "But Bradley, your career isn't the real tragedy here. The real tragedy is the officers whose careers you damaged, the people who left the Navy because they couldn't survive your toxic leadership, the mission effectiveness that was compromised by your inability to build functional teams." Elena stood and walked back to her briefcase. She withdrew another folder, thinner than the first, and placed it on the table. "This contains the names of 7 officers who have requested transfers or left the Navy entirely rather than continue serving under your command. 7 careers altered or ended because one man's insecurity was more important than the institution's mission." Rourke opened the folder with trembling hands. Elena watched his face as he read through the names. People he had worked with, people whose potential he had actively undermined, people who might have become outstanding naval officers if they had been given proper leadership and support. "I remember all of them," he whispered. I thought I was making them stronger." "You were making yourself feel stronger by making them feel weaker," Elena corrected. "There's a difference." Rourke closed the folder and sat back in his chair. When he looked at Elena again, his expression had changed completely. The arrogance was gone, the defensive anger had evaporated, and what remained was something that looked like genuine remorse. "Admiral," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't change anything, and I know it's too late for the people I've hurt, but I want you to know that I understand now. I see what I became, and I'm sorry." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. What she saw instead was the kind of fundamental shift in perspective that only came from having one's core assumptions completely shattered. "Bradley, do you understand why I chose to reveal my identity during the emergency rather than maintain my cover?" "Because you put saving lives above protecting your investigation," he said without hesitation. "That's correct. Do you understand what that means about the difference between our approaches to leadership?" Rourke nodded slowly. "You were willing to sacrifice your mission to protect your people. I was willing to sacrifice my people to protect my ego." Elena felt something unexpected, not satisfaction at having defeated an antagonist, but sadness at seeing the waste of potential. Rourke was not fundamentally a bad person. He was an intelligent, dedicated officer who had been shaped by flawed models and had never learned better ways of exercising authority. "What happens to me now?" he asked. Elena picked up the relief order from the table. "You'll face a formal board of inquiry, which will likely result in administrative separation from the Navy. Your service record will reflect the circumstances of your relief, which will make civilian employment in security or defense contracting difficult. You'll probably need to rebuild your career in an entirely different field." Rourke absorbed this information with surprising calm. "And the officers I've hurt? Is there anything I can do to help them?" Elena felt a flicker of hope. This was the first time Rourke had asked about making amends rather than protecting himself. You can cooperate fully with the investigation. You can provide honest testimony about your actions and their effects. You can acknowledge publicly that the complaints against you were legitimate, which will help clear the records of the officers who filed them. And beyond that? Elena considered the question. Beyond that, you can learn from this experience. You can make sure that if you ever find yourself in a position of authority again, you remember what real leadership looks like. Rourke stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. When he came to attention this time, it wasn't the rigid posture of someone trying to project authority. It was the respectful bearing of someone acknowledging legitimate command. "Admiral, permission to make a personal statement." "Granted." "Ma'am, I want to thank you for showing me what I should have been. I know that sounds strange given the circumstances, but this conversation has been the most valuable learning experience of my military career. I wish I had been capable of this kind of self-reflection years ago." Elena nodded. "Bradley, you're 42 years old. Your military career is over, but your life isn't. What you do with this lesson, how you apply it going forward, that's up to you." Rourke picked up the relief order and folded it carefully, placing it in his uniform pocket. "Ma'am, if it's appropriate to ask, what made you different? What allowed you to become the kind of leader I failed to be?" Elena thought about the question, about the years of training and experience and mentorship that had shaped her approach to command. "I had good teachers," she said finally, "and I made different choices about what strength means." 3 weeks after the communications building emergency, Elena stood in the same conference room where she had confronted Bradley Rourke, but the atmosphere was completely different. The space was filled with base personnel, officers, enlisted, civilians, all of them gathered for what the Navy officially called a leadership transition briefing, but what everyone understood to be something more significant. Elena had spent those 3 weeks conducting the most thorough investigation of toxic leadership in recent naval history. She had interviewed 127 personnel, reviewed 5 years of fitness reports and incident documentation, and compiled a comprehensive assessment of systemic failures in junior officer development and oversight. The results were damning and illuminating in equal measure. Bradley Rourke had not been an isolated case. He had been the predictable result of leadership development processes that emphasized technical competence over human relation skills, that rewarded aggressive behavior disguised as decisiveness, and that failed to provide adequate mentorship for officers transitioning from tactical to leadership roles. More disturbing, Elena had discovered that complaints about Rourke's behavior had been documented and dismissed at multiple levels of command. Senior officers had been aware of the problems, but had chosen to transfer problem personnel rather than address the root causes. The system had protected an incompetent leader at the expense of promising junior officers. That was about to change. Captain Patricia Wells stood at Elena's side as she addressed the gathered personnel. Wells had been officially confirmed as the new department commander, and her first act had been to implement a series of reforms that Elena had recommended. "Over the past 3 weeks," Elena began, "this command has undergone a comprehensive review of leadership practices and personnel management procedures. Today, I want to share with you what we've learned and what changes will be implemented going forward." She gestured toward a large display screen that showed organizational charts and policy summaries. But her real attention was on the faces in the audience. Young officers and enlisted personnel who had endured months or years of toxic leadership, watching to see if the Navy would actually follow through on its promises of change. First, effective immediately, this command is implementing a 360-degree feedback system for all officers in leadership positions. This means that your performance will be evaluated not just by your superiors, but by your subordinates and peers as well. A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. Traditional military evaluation systems flowed strictly upward. Subordinates did not formally assess their commanders. Elena was proposing a fundamental shift in how leadership accountability would work. Second, we are establishing a confidential reporting system for leadership concerns. Any personnel who observe behavior that undermines unit cohesion, discriminates against protected classes, or creates hostile work environments will have direct access to senior command through secure, anonymous channels. Elena could see some of the officers shifting uncomfortably. They understood that their behavior would now be subject to scrutiny from multiple directions, that the old model of command authority without accountability was ending. Third, all officers in leadership positions will undergo mandatory training in modern leadership principles, diversity and inclusion practices, and crisis management procedures. This training will be ongoing and will be reflected in fitness reports and promotion considerations. Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her face showing careful attention, but also something that looked like hope. Elena had recommended Chen for accelerated promotion and had arranged for her to attend advanced leadership development programs. The young officer who had been systematically undermined by Rourke's toxic leadership was about to become an example of what effective mentorship could accomplish. These changes, Elena continued, are not just procedural reforms. They represent a fundamental shift in how this command understands leadership responsibility. We are moving from a model based on hierarchy and dominance to one based on competence and care for personnel. Elena paused, looking around the room at faces that represented the future of naval leadership. Young sailors and Marines and officers who would carry these lessons forward into their own commands, who would either perpetuate the old failures or create new models of effectiveness. "I want to be clear about something," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from decades of successful command. "These reforms are not about lowering standards or making military service easier. They are about raising standards, insisting that leaders demonstrate not just technical competence, but human competence as well." She clicked to the next slide, which showed performance metrics from comparable commands that had implemented similar reforms. Units with effective leadership development programs show measurably better results in mission accomplishment, personnel retention, and operational readiness. Treating people with dignity and respect doesn't compromise military effectiveness, it enhances it. Elena could see some of the senior officers nodding in recognition. They had experienced both good and bad leadership during their careers, and they understood intuitively that fear-based command structures were less effective than trust-based ones. "Captain Wells will be implementing these changes over the next 6 months, Elena concluded. "During that transition period, I will be available for consultation and oversight. But the success of these reforms will ultimately depend on each of you, your willingness to embrace new models of leadership, your commitment to protecting the people under your command, and your understanding that authority exists to serve the mission, not personal ego." Elena stepped back from the podium and invited questions. For the next hour, she fielded queries about implementation details, policy implications, and practical concerns about how the new systems would work. But the most significant moment came when a young petty officer raised his hand and asked, "Ma'am, how do we know these changes will stick? How do we know that once you leave, things won't go back to the way they were?" It was a fair question, one that reflected the cynicism that develops when personnel have seen reform initiatives fail repeatedly. Elena had anticipated it. "Petty officer, that's exactly why these reforms are being implemented at the institutional level, not just the local level. The Chief of Naval Operations has directed that similar programs be established across all major commands. This isn't an experiment. It's a fundamental change in how the Navy develops and evaluates leadership." She paused, looking directly at the young sailor who had asked the question. "But you're right to be skeptical. Institutional change only works if the people within the institution are committed to it. That means each of you has a responsibility to hold your leaders accountable, to speak up when you see problems, and to model the kind of behavior you want to see from others." Elena gestured toward Lieutenant Chen. "Lieutenant Chen, would you please stand?" Chen rose, clearly surprised to be singled out. 3 weeks ago, Elena said, Lieutenant Chen demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that these reforms are designed to protect and encourage. During the communications emergency, she provided critical intelligence to her commanding officer and made recommendations that saved lives. When her input was dismissed, she continued to advocate for the trapped personnel. Elena's voice carried a note of pride. Lieutenant Chen understood that her responsibility to the mission was more important than her comfort with hierarchy. She chose to do what was right rather than what was safe. That is the standard we want every officer in this command to meet. Chen sat back down, her face flushed but her bearing proud. Around her, other personnel were looking at her with new respect, not as the officer who had been targeted by Rourke's harassment, but as someone who had demonstrated genuine leadership under pressure. The changes we're implementing, Elena continued, are designed to ensure that courage like Lieutenant Chen's is rewarded rather than punished, that speaking truth to power is seen as a strength rather than a threat, and that protecting your people is understood to be the highest duty of command. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out, Elena found herself surrounded by a small group of junior officers, lieutenants and ensigns who had served under Rourke's toxic leadership and were beginning to understand that their experiences had not been normal or acceptable. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we wanted to thank you for what you did, not just the investigation, but showing us what real leadership looks like." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from being acknowledged for simply doing what she believed was right. "You don't need to thank me," she said, "but I do need something from you." They waited attentively. "I need you to remember what you've learned here. I need you to carry these lessons forward when you have your own commands. And I need you to make sure that the next generation of naval officers never has to experience the kind of toxic leadership you've endured." One of the lieutenants, a young man whose fitness reports had been systematically undermined by Rourke's biases, spoke up. "Ma'am, how do we do that? How do we make sure we become better leaders than what we experienced?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in weeks. "You start by understanding that leadership is not about proving you're stronger than everyone else. It's about making everyone else stronger than they knew they could be." 3 days later, Elena stood on the pier at Naval Base Coronado, watching the sun set over San Diego Bay. Her official assignment was complete, her investigation concluded, her recommendations submitted and approved. Tomorrow, she would return to Washington for reassignment to her next challenge. Captain Wells joined her at the pier's edge, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the nearby galley. "How do you think they'll do?" Wells asked, handing Elena one of the cups. Elena considered the question as she watched a group of young sailors conducting evening maintenance on a nearby destroyer. They worked with quiet efficiency, helping each other with difficult tasks, sharing expertise across rank and rating boundaries. It was the kind of collaborative teamwork that emerged when people trusted their leaders and felt valued by their organization. "They'll do well," Elena said finally. "The foundation is solid now, the systems are in place, and most importantly, they understand what good leadership looks like." Wells nodded. "What about Rourke? Any word on his board of inquiry?" "Administrative separation with general discharge. He'll keep his pension but lose his security clearance. He's already started applying for civilian positions in logistics management." "Think he learned anything from this?" Elena thought about her final conversation with Bradley Rourke, about the hollow recognition in his eyes when he finally understood the scope of his failures. "I think he learned more about himself in 1 week than he had in the previous 20 years. Whether he applies that knowledge constructively, that's up to him." Elena's secure phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Vice Admiral Thompson. "New assignment briefing scheduled for Monday or 800. Similar parameters to Coronado, Norfolk Naval Station, another base, another toxic leader, another opportunity to protect young officers from the kind of systematic harassment that destroyed careers and compromised missions." Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but it was a weight she carried willingly. "Patricia," she said, "I need to ask you something." Wells raised an eyebrow. "Do you ever get tired of fighting the same battles over and over, dealing with the same problems, the same personality types, the same systemic failures?" Wells was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and crimson. "Elena," she said finally, "do you know what the difference is between us and the people we're fighting against?" Elena waited. They get tired, they burn out, or they get caught, or they finally push too far and destroy themselves. But we don't get tired. Because we're not fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every young officer who deserves better, every sailor who wants to serve with dignity, every Marine who believes the system can be fair. Wells turned to face Elena directly. The day we get tired is the day they win, and I'm not ready to let them win. Elena nodded slowly. It was exactly the answer she had needed to hear, the reminder of why this work mattered despite its personal costs. She finished her coffee and checked her watch. In 6 hours, she would be on a plane to Washington. In 72 hours, she would be someone else. Another cover identity, another investigation, another chance to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Bradley Rourke's career was over. His toxic leadership had been exposed and ended. The systems that had enabled his behavior had been reformed. And most importantly, the officers he had targeted were safe to continue their careers with renewed confidence and support. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing ever was in the complex world of military politics and bureaucracy. But it was meaningful progress, measurable improvement in the lives of real people who deserved better from their leaders and their institution. Elena walked back toward the base parking lot where a car was waiting to take her to the airport. As she passed groups of sailors and Marines conducting evening duties, several of them recognized her and nodded respectfully. Some even smiled, the kind of acknowledgement that came from people who knew their leaders cared about their welfare. One young petty officer approached her as she reached the parking area. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for showing us that the system can work." Elena stopped walking. "What's your name, petty officer?" "Rodriguez, ma'am. I was one of the people who filed a complaint about Lieutenant Commander Rourke. I thought nothing would come of it, but you filed it anyway," Elena finished. "You spoke up despite thinking it wouldn't matter. That took courage." Rodriguez smiled. "Ma'am, someone told me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid." Elena felt something unexpected. Pride not in her own accomplishments, but in this young sailor who had chosen to trust the system, despite having every reason to be cynical about it. "Who told you that, petty officer?" "You did, ma'am, during your briefing 3 days ago." Elena smiled. "Well then, I guess I learned something." 2. As her car pulled away from the base, Elena looked back at the sprawling complex of buildings and training facilities that housed thousands of young Americans learning what it meant to serve their country. Some of them would become outstanding leaders, others would struggle with the responsibilities of command, and a few would fail completely. But because of the changes implemented over the past 3 weeks, fewer of them would fail due to lack of proper mentorship, toxic leadership, or systemic discrimination. The Navy was becoming a little bit better, one base at a time, one reformed command structure at a time. Elena opened her secure phone and began reviewing the preliminary files for her next assignment. Norfolk Naval Station, similar parameters to Coronado, another opportunity to protect the people who had chosen to protect everyone else. She allowed herself a small smile as the car merged onto the highway toward the airport. Somewhere out there, a toxic leader was about to discover that their behavior had consequences, that their abuse of authority would not go unnoticed or unpunished. They just didn't know it yet, but they would. The quiet ones always made sure they did. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.